Guys, I'm currently in Lichfield, and this right here is a listed plunge pool surrounded by a moat. Should we get into it? Let's get into it.
Just off Old Street in Streethay, there's an old house that looks as though it's always been what it is now. Quiet, historic, and slightly tucked away from the modern world around it. But the story of this place is not as simple as that, because the Manor at Streethay has not had one life. It's had several. The house standing here today is mostly early 17th century, but the site itself goes back much further than that. By the middle of the 1200s, there was already an estate here, held by a family who took the name from the place. The Streethay family were connected to this land for generations, and this was the centre of their estate. Now that's worth remembering, because when people hear the word manor, they sometimes imagine something grand and romantic, almost like a small castle. But a manor was not only about appearance, it was about land, money, farming, rights, rent and local authority. It was the place where the business of the estate came together. And at Streethay, that manor was surrounded by water. Parts of the old moat still survive today, especially on the western and southern sides of the site. Some of it's been filled in and some of it's changed over the centuries, but the shape of the old moated site is still there if you know where to look for it. A moat around a manor house was not always about defence. Now obviously it could protect a house, but it also showed status. It separated the manor from the ordinary land around it, and it made the house feel more important before anyone even reached the front door. The first major change in the story came in 1591 when Philip Streethay sold the manor to Richard Poyet, a London alderman. That sale ended the old Streethay family's long connection with the estate and brought in a new family who seemed to have reshaped the place. The house was probably rebuilt in the early 1600s during the early Poyet period. A coat of arms had been granted in 1610, and local history records say those arms were later placed above the doorway of the house. That might sound like a small detail, but it says quite a lot. You don't put your coat of arms above the door unless you want people to know exactly who owns the place. This was not just about comfort. It was about status, identity and making a statement. By 1666, the house was taxed on 14 earths, which tells us it was a sizable residence for the time. A smaller home might have had 1 or 2 hearths, but 14 put Streethay Manor into a different category. It wasn't just another rural house, it was a proper gentleman's residence. But the house we see now is not the whole of that grander building. Local history suggests the earlier manor once had a more impressive front, with 3 gables, and that what survives today is largely part of an older rear range. In 1792, most of the larger house was demolished, leaving behind the quieter, smaller survivor that remains today. So when you look at the manor now, you're not really looking at the full manor house, you're looking at what was left behind. The moat also changed over time. In 1704, records show that the Great Moat was cleaned out and converted into a fish farm. Personally, I think that's one of the best details of the old story, because it shows how these old landscapes didn't just freeze in time. What may have started as part of a medieval manorial setting later became something practical. The water was managed, reused and turned into part of the estate's working life. And then, close to the house, there's another feature that makes the place even more unusual. A small stone plunge bath. It's not always been understood what it was. At one point it was described as a wellhead, which is easy to understand because from the outside that's probably what most people would assume it was. However, the listing was later corrected and it's now identified as a plunge bath. It's thought to be probably 17th century, built in stone with a small doorway and a corbelled roof. It's not a big building, but it does look awesome, and it adds a more private side to the story of the manor. A plunge pool points us away from farming and estate management, and more towards comfort, health and the way that people shape the grounds around their homes. It gives the place a different feel, because suddenly this is not a working estate or an old family seat, with private habits and little luxuries attached to it. But perhaps the most surprising chapter comes much later. By the 20th century, this old manor house had not remained as one grand historic home. According to a newspaper article from August 1967, the building had been divided into 3 labourers' cottages before it was bought by Bert and Nora Allen. When they bought it, around 8 years before the article was written, it was in a poor state. The only water came from a 60-foot well in the garden, and there was no proper sanitation. It's hard to imagine that now because the word manor makes the place sound comfortable and settled. But by then it had clearly fallen a long way from the world of coats of arms, moats and 14 hearths. The Allens seemed to have taken on the kind of job most people would have walked away from. They planned the restoration themselves, called in an architect. and then did a huge amount of work with their own hands. Bert Allen had been a school woodwork master, so he knew how to design and make doors, repair timber, and restore the old character of the building. Some of the work sounds brutal. The article says that when they removed a fireplace from a solid stone wall, 27 inches thick, Bert ended up with his wrists in bandages for weeks afterwards. Nora was just as involved in bringing the place back to life, but in a slightly different way. She collected old furniture and antiques, travelling by train and bus to sales because she didn't drive. She filled the house with things that suited the building, often picking up pieces for tiny amounts of money. There's a little detail in the article where she bought Indian goblets for 8 shillings, only to find out later that they were actually gold. It's the sort of story that makes the restoration feel human, because this was not just a building project. For the Allens, it became a way of life. After 8 years, the work still wasn't finished. The beams had been cleaned by hand, with the article saying they'd taken 17 bathfuls of dirt from the old timbers. Visitors kept suggesting that the beamed loft should become a ballroom, but the Allens seemed more interested in making it feel like a home again. That 1967 article changes the way you look at the place now, because the Manor at Streethay is not just a medieval site with a moat, and it's not just a 17th century house. It's also a building that almost disappeared into ordinary use, divided into cottages and stripped of comfort, and then slowly pulled back into something that looked like a manor house again. That's what makes this place interesting to me, along with the visuals that I knew I'd be able to capture on camera. It's been a medieval estate, a moated manor, a gentleman's residence, a partly demolished survivor, 3 labourers' cottages, and then a restoration project taken on by 2 people who could see something in it that others had missed. And the best part is, not all of that story is hidden in documents. Some of it's still there in the place itself. It's in the surviving house and the old moat, even that strange little plunge pool in the corner of the garden. Now, the manor don't tell its story loudly, and it was very hard for me to research in the time I had, but most of this information comes from historic England and Victoria County history.